Yeah. Great. So people can live stream tonight. Shall we get started? What do you think? We're here at 7:03.
Yep, let's go for it.
Let me introduce Rob. Rob is a good friend of mine. Let me start with that. He and I actually get together every week to have a conversation and to check in with each other. And I deeply value him as my friend. So that's first of all. So I am biased. I will tell you that. Rob is a professor at Lewis and Clark in religion, but has done extensive study with climate change. And when on one of our conversations a couple of months ago, Rob told me that he had given a 3-week series at a Presbyterian church up in Portland. And I said, aha, I'm looking for content for our pub talks. Would you be interested? And he said, of course. So thank you, Rob, for being with us. This is a critical subject and we need to be talking about it. So thank you.
Yep. Yeah. So, and back at you, John. Yes. Good friend. And value the friendship. Appreciate it. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna go ahead and use the PowerPoint for us because I want to get through this material. So let me share my screen with you. Actually, first. I haven't been teaching on Zoom for a while, so it's like it's been in person. It's been wonderful, but as a consequence, not as facile as I was a few weeks ago. Come on, there we go. All right. Are you seeing the slideshow?
Yes.
Yeah, and if I go to, now you should see it as a slideshow. There we go.
Yep.
All right. So just get going here. Well, come on. There we go. Whoop. So tonight we're going to do this, understanding the threat of global climate change and tipping points in particular. Consequences for Oregon. I try and focus this on Oregon in particular because that's where you'll see. I mean, I think the bottom line is we sort of have to make the argument that where we can be effective is at the state level. It's very difficult to think of being effective at other levels, and we'll see why. I want to talk a bit tonight about the urgency of action, and as I said, a rationale for this Oregon approach. Next week, we'll take a look at ongoing climate action in Oregon, and the news is generally pretty good in terms of what Oregon is doing, in terms of what Oregon needs to be doing. The news isn't that great, but it's better than it is in other states, and we've got some good directions. And we'll also talk about this concept of social tipping points and how we can be a part of that. And then the last week, we'll talk about a way forward, triggering positive tipping points, avoiding disastrous tipping points. What I really mean by that is what we can do, how we can be active and useful in trying to address the problem. So let's, golly, it keeps going back. There we go. Let's start with some of the basics. So the undeniable reality, right? We've changed the planet's climate. So if you already know this science, you can sort of close your ears for a few minutes, but I always find it important to get some basics across for folks and make sure they understand these things. So you know how this works. So 51% of the visible wavelengths of the sun's radiation that come through the Earth's atmosphere, it's absorbed by the Earth's surface. That gets returned to the atmosphere in water vapor, CO2, natural CO2, carbon, methane, other gases. The atmosphere absorbs some of that infrared radiation, right? And emits it back down to the Earth's surface. And that just keeps happening. That's the natural greenhouse effect that we all know about that keeps the Earth's temperature at roughly 59, average of 59 degrees Fahrenheit, 15 degrees centigrade. Without the greenhouse effect, so oftentimes people think the greenhouse effect is completely bad. Without it, we would be a frozen planet. So the natural balance depends on some kind of greenhouse effect. So those are all natural production of GHGs, greenhouse gases. It's the anthropogenic greenhouse gases, that is, ones we create. Every time we create some, anywhere on the planet, it adds to that atmospheric blanket around the entire planet. So I can drive my car over to Safeway and back, and I've already, added a few more GHGs to the atmospheric blanket. So what I do driving over to Safeway to get a gallon of milk, because we forgot something in the grocery list, has an impact not just on me, but somebody in Australia, somebody in Beijing, and so forth. So you understand how this works, right? So when we do that, every time we're creating new anthropogenic, that is human-caused GHG emissions, we're adding to the infrared radiation and ensuring that that blanket gets thicker, as it were. So one way to think about what has happened to us over time, or what we have done to ourselves, a better way to say it, is before the Industrial Revolution, the natural levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, that is carbon dioxide, not counting it, methane and other greenhouse gases, simply carbon dioxide, it ranged anywhere from 175 to 300 parts per million. That's all safe. Okay. Once people became aware of what we were doing, they began also to measure what would be unsafe. And when I actually I got interested in climate change well before 350 became sort of the number. So 350.org, for instance, is one of the groups that works to address climate change. They were founded on the principle that we should stop at 350. Well, we've blown past that, right? So 350 parts per million is considered really the threshold beyond which we start engaging in dangerous change, climate warming. We're now at 419 parts per million. That actually, let me know if you get, when I do this, do you still just see the PowerPoint? Or do you actually see the EPA website that I clicked to? Anybody?
No, we just see the PowerPoint.
You still see the PowerPoint. Yeah, it's going to be too much of a hassle to go back and forth. We don't have enough time. So let me do this. I mean, you can click on these links. I'll share the slides with you after we're done, if you want them. But hold on a sec. Let me get this out of the way. So in terms of GHG emissions in the US, so in 2020, 79% of our GHG emissions were CO2, carbon dioxide, methane, 11%. That's a number that's actually going up, and that's a problem. Nitrous oxide, 7%, fluorinated gases, a small percentage as well. So you get the idea. The number is going up, and it's going up way too fast for us. It's probably past 419 now. This is a slide I made back in February. Numbers have really been climbing quickly as of late. So as I said, methane's the most potent. It accounts for now 20 to 25% of all GHGs. People are now beginning to measure methane better than they have in the past. The impact on warming is 25, actually, some people will say up to 35 times that of CO2. So really intense greenhouse gases, dangerous greenhouse gases. Lasts in the atmosphere a much shorter time, about a century, as opposed to 300 to 1,000 years for CO2. But you can see why if you've been reading the news, there's a lot of concern about methane these days. I'm actually part of the Metro Climate Action Team, the transportation subgroup, and we just recently had a bit of a debate, argument about what we should recommend to the state of Oregon as it tries to enhance its clean fuels program. And one of the questions is whether blue hydrogen should be allowed or not. The problem with blue hydrogen is it tends to emit a lot of methane in its production as well as in its burning. So difficult kind of questions to face. Okay, so we move to the next slide. So there are consequences. There's really immediate consequences in terms of the warming of the planet. So we see it in the global economy in terms of decreased agricultural productivity, increased costs of crop production, damage to supply lines. We're seeing it all the time. You just have to turn the news on in the evening. You see the evidence of it. The impacts in international conflicts, and I had to add this, since I presented this in February. So we clearly have threats to water supplies in the Middle East that are really shaping the conflicts there. So people often overlook the fact that the Syrian war, a large component of it was access to water. Israel and Palestine, that conflict has, oftentimes at the center of the debate is access to water. The economic crisis in Afghanistan is in many ways climate driven. The link here, I'm not going to take you to it. It's actually a letter to the editor by none other than Kugler. That argued, what is going on here? Sorry, guys. Keep skipping my slide. Hold on a sec. That points out that this, in fact, is, hold on a sec, I gotta get this fixed. That this particular war is exactly that. It is a climate-driven war. Okay, here we go. Let me get back there. Sorry, guys. What's wrong with this? Okay, now you're back. It just wants to skip that slide. It's so weird. Yeah. All right. So another impact, population movements. The 2015 migration crisis out of Syria was a pretty astounding example of this. We don't hear much about this right now because of the war in Ukraine, but we have this continuing exodus from Afghanistan. We've for a long time had economic refugees from Central America. You think of particularly the highlands in Central America that have simply become uninhabitable in terms of agricultural production. So those are pretty clear consequences for the planet. So the immediate consequences of warming temperatures in Oregon, we're all pretty familiar with it, right? So we had our heat wave, was it last summer, 2 summers ago? But more importantly, over the long haul, that was a weather event. Climate is evident in the number of over 90 degree days in Oregon. That's been climbing steadily for the last several decades. But more importantly, nighttime lows are not as low as they used to be, which means that the overall temperature doesn't drop enough, drying out the ground. So with extreme heat, we get increased drought, so higher incidences of drought that is more frequent. The extent is longer. The severity, the depth of them is intensified. And that's exacerbated by the failure of mountain snowpack and the fact that the mountain snowpack runs off too early to be as useful as it needs to be. So the Klamath Basin this year is facing we already know that they're going to face some really serious problems this summer and significantly difficult choices in terms of agriculture and ensuring enough water flow, for instance, for fish and wildlife. Obviously, then the incidence of wildfire increases, and we've seen that as well in the last few years, and we can expect that to only get worse. And that used to be something that only occurred on the east side of the Cascades. Now it's going to be occurring on both sides of the Cascades because of everything above, drought and extreme heat. Ironically, then, of course, flooding. You think, well, we're short on water. What about flooding? It's all a matter of how the earth itself responds. So instead of getting steady rain like we have had in the last few weeks, this has been wonderful. We tend to get sudden onslaughts. That's going to be more and more the pattern. When you have a sudden flow of precipitation onto a habitat that has been dried out, the ground doesn't soak up the water as it should. It tends to run off, causing higher incidence of flooding, more severe flooding. So the shift in precipitation patterns really affect us. So yeah, this is what I missed. Okay. So long-term consequences for the planet. This is backwards. I should have done this slide first, but you'll get it. You've seen it, melting glaciers, thawing permafrost, probably one of the most frightening things. Permafrost contains large quantities of methane. And with that stuff melting, as it melts, it releases methane into the atmosphere. And that really is a truly disturbing trend. Rising sea levels, warming oceans, blurring of biosphere boundaries. What we mean by that is a biosphere might be, for instance, you think of sort of bands across the planet, and those biospheres have typically bounded various kinds of flora and fauna. As those biosphere boundaries blur, flora and fauna move, the ones that can, to the climates that they can tolerate. The ones that can't die. We'll see, sort of the accelerating sixth extinction. People talk about the fact that we seem to be in a new extinction, the sixth, in terms of geological and natural history. That will be sped up as a consequence because of these blurring of biospheres. But the other thing is, when flora and fauna do move from one biosphere band to the next, it has significant impacts on human habitation, sometimes actually positive, but more often than not negative. So positive in the sense that you can grow things in places that you used to not be able to grow things in. Negative in that you end up having various kinds of fauna that are unwelcome in your environment where you've settled as human beings. So the question is, are we facing tipping points and the possibility of a global cascade? And this I do want to share with you. So I'm going to stop the share and go to this other thing. And I'm going to throw the dog out. Can you tell him to come out? She'll just stare at me. Go on, out, guys. Both of you. Come on. Sorry, guys. So this is an article from Nature, and again, you might want to, if you get the PowerPoint, you're welcome to click on this and go see it. It's by Timothy Lenton and a number of other scholars, but Lenton is the lead author and an important figure in all of this. And his argument here is it's a little disturbing, but his point is we just can't afford to run up against the risk of some of these tipping points, because if we hit enough of them all at once, there will be what we call a global cascade, and there's nothing we can do when that happens. There's nothing we can do to stop what will happen to us as a planet and as a people. So it's a very powerful piece in the sense that it tells you we have to act, and it reminds you of the fact that we have the capacity to act. We have the resources. We just have to have the political will as well, and we'll get to that. Okay, so back to the PowerPoint. So there are ongoing long-term consequences. I got the slides out of order. I did the short-term consequences first, but long-term consequences for Oregon are these. So at the rate we're going right now, we rose 2.2 Fahrenheit in a century. Doesn't sound like much, but it is. It's a lot, actually, because when you treat that as a climatic as opposed to a weather event, it changes your biosphere in ways that, again, can be welcome, but also quite unwelcome. If we keep going in the same direction at about the same rate, we'll get up by 5 degrees by the 2050s, 8 by the 2080s. That's a pretty terrifying prospect. It changes our world in ways that we don't really want to imagine. So when we say decreased precipitation in the summer, probably almost curtailed to the point of being insignificant. Increased precipitation in the winter, and as I explained before, when you have that drying effect in the summers, and then the sudden onslaught of rain and water in the winters, it's not rain that does you any good. It floods, it runs into the estuaries and off into the ocean. Reduced snowpack, and of course, a lower hydrological value. So we may measure snowpack in depth, but you also, when you measure a snowpack, you also measure how much water it actually contains. So you can have a very deep snowpack, but a low hydrological value, which means that your runoff is going to be fairly less significant, correspondingly less significant. So we have seen a reduced hydrological value to a reduced snowpack, so a double whammy in effect. So this is, again, premature and reduced runoff are problems. So we have, as I say, mostly negative accelerating changes across Oregon's ecosystems. And again, if you want to click on the link, you'll see that there's, it's a nice way of seeing Oregon's various ecosystems. And we have a fairly wide range of them across the state. And if you've traveled around the state, you know that already. You can just feel them and see them. There's a terrific stress on the built environment. So hydropower is and we depend on hydropower to an extent that really has saved us on our energy bills over decades. Hydropower is facing some difficulties. We have infrastructure in cities like Portland where the stormwater infrastructure is increasingly under threat because of sudden onslaughts of water. The increased urban heat island effect, which affects mostly disadvantaged populations. So there's a big component of justice in climate change, as we know. There's an increased power demand in the summertime for cooling. So we have impacts on public health. And again, especially frontline, minority, low-income, rural, tribal communities. They are all the ones who really are most deeply impacted by these things. We also see a lot of stress on community, what we call community sustaining social systems, the economy, the political system, educational institutions, our cultural heritage. All those things are being stressed by this. So climate change doesn't, it's not just the warming of the environment. It's something that really affects us at all levels in just about every way we can imagine. So, what does this mean? There are some really clear imperatives, I think. And that is, we have to reduce to zero, effectively, anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. So they do have to cease. And we now know that carbon has to be removed from the atmosphere as well. It's not going to be enough for us to simply stop. We could stop today by some miracle. And we would still need to remove some greenhouse gases from the atmosphere to give ourselves a reasonable chance for the future. So actually, this is a useful time to say this. You should sort of think about climate action as three-part. Mitigation, that is what we do to reduce the greenhouse gases that we emit into the environment. So electrifying, et cetera. Adaptation, we must realize that we are stuck with some of this and there's nothing we can do other than to adapt to it. We have to be able to find ways to ensure that people who are most affected by the change that's going to happen no matter what we do are not affected too terribly. And there was even some good legislation in the the off-year session here that just ended a few weeks ago in the state legislature, and we'll come back to that later. And then the other thing we have to do is carbon removal. So that's the third part. Usually people talk about adaptation, mitigation, and avoiding what I say is resignation. That's not an option as far as I'm concerned. But I think the third, or the excluding resignation, the third component is removing GHGs as well. And that's sort of a new frontier. So the first imperative is getting to zero emissions by 2050. That's been a goal for a while. You've seen it sort of drop off the radar screen because of all the politics and the war, et cetera, but it's still there and it has to be achieved. And don't be fooled. So this is helpful as you hear the rhetoric. People will talk about net zero That is a really dangerous illusion these days. So industry and petrostates, that is nation states as well as states within our union, that make their money off of off of fossil fuel production. They'll tell you that it's all about net zero. Some NGOs, non-governmental organizations, are sort of have bought into this. And there's lots of individuals who have bought into it. The idea that you can embrace carbon offsets, for instance. So Mitzi and I are going to fly to Singapore to see our daughter. And we'll do it. We'll buy some carbon offsets. We're not going to not go to Singapore. It's important for us to continue to be parents and family, et cetera. But part of me thinks, what really is best is if I just never get on that airplane and the airplane never flies, because right now we are to the point now where every time we add a bit of greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere, somehow that has to either be drawn back by carbon offsets, or better yet, never burnt in the first place. But this whole net zero idea sort of sets up this illusion. It's smoke and mirror carbon accounting, to declare themselves net zero. So when you see corporations saying we're going to be net zero, you really have to ask, how are you going to be net zero? Are you going to do that by buying carbon offsets and planting trees, which are going to take 40, 50, 60, sometimes 70 or 80 years to actually draw back the carbon that you've just expended in the course of 3 months? So you all see how this works, right? So really the goal for us has got to be to get to the point where we do everything without burning fossil fuels. And the good news is it's a possibility. We can do this. Even at 419 parts per million, the bad news is we have too little of the so-called carbon budget left to spend it on electricity and transportation and industry and agriculture. We shouldn't be using fossil fuel to do that. But the good news is we have the technology that's necessary to fuel most of those enterprises with renewable energy. We know it. We've got the technology. Everybody says it. There's a scholar at Stanford University, Mark Z. Jacobson. I've got his book on my shelf. Who basically, as an engineer and a climate scientist, with his group of graduate students over the last 10 years, keeps constructing the model. And they say it's possible with wind, sun, and water. We can do it. We just need the political will and to spend the money. So the second imperative is returning to, as I say, 350 parts per million by carbon removal. There are ways to do this. There's natural carbon sequestration, so preserving forest lands. Oregon actually has made some really great advances over the last 2 legislative sessions. We have a much better Department of Forestry now, led by a much better state forester that works both with public lands and private forest owners to really work at carbon sequestration. That's really good news. We need to adopt more carbon capturing and carbon retaining agricultural practices. There's plenty of opportunity in the state of Oregon for that. People just need to sort of learn what it is and that it really is not more costly. And in fact, in some cases, it's less costly. And in some cases, probably more productive for the land. And there are other nature assisting practices. That is, where we assist nature in doing it. There is also this direct carbon capture process. So again, I'm not going to take the time to click on the links. Carbon 180 is an organization that sort of tracks the development of direct air carbon capture. It's an emerging technology. It's still expensive. It's still energy intensive itself. So you need lots of renewable energy to make it work. But there are emerging markets, and there's a lot of hope for negative emissions. So we'll hope, fingers crossed, right? The problem is right now, we're not responding effectively to the crisis at all, right? So in 2021, even with the trailing effects of the pandemic, greenhouse gas emissions went back up again, rose by 6%. 6%. That's a small percentage. The percentage is increasing now and speeding up because our economy is cooking along. So it's an awful thing to say when I see talk of recession. I tend to think of my pocketbook and your pocketbook. And then my next thought is, but recessions reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's a terrible thought, right? But it's true. When the economy slows down, we burn less fossil fuel. There you go. So electricity production really is producing less new carbon. The problem is coal burning plants are continuing to operate in Europe and in the United States. New ones are coming online in China and in some other developing countries. So that's the one kind of electricity production we absolutely cannot afford. Carbon or coal is one of the worst offenders. And the war in Ukraine has not helped the cause at all. Transportation, at least until the war, really was the dominant cause of increasing GHG emissions. So certainly at the state level, you'll see when we get to it, focusing on transportation. Transportation accounts for 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions in Oregon. That's a lot. And that's something we can tackle. We really can be effective in dealing with it. NDCs, National Determined Contributions under the Paris Climate Accord. The problem here is they all fall short of the goal of keeping 1.5 alive. That was the rallying cry for the 26th Conference of Parties that just was a few months ago. Many people think the 1.5, that is 1.5 Celsius increase. That's where we would arrest climate change. We'd stop there. Many people think that's now dead. It probably is, but that should not stop us from, this is not a cause to throw your hands up in the air in despair and say, well, if we cross the threshold of 1.5, everything is gone. Well, maybe we're at 1.6, 1.7. Every tenth makes a difference, but yes, every tenth we don't go up makes a difference as well. So the fact that 1.5 is probably no longer alive is not a reason for despair. It's just a reason to redouble our efforts and get focused on keeping it below 2. All right. But what's the reason? You sort of ask, why is it that we can't tackle this problem? This is a civilizational challenge, and we should be able to do this. So why the problem? There is this he's a climate scientist and philosopher. And again, you can click on the link, the word bewilderment. What he argues is, I'm trying to think of his name. I've got his other book sitting right here. Byron Williston, he's Canadian. And his argument is that, he says, look, through human history, we have sort of hit these hinge points in human history where we have civilization at large has been unable, it faces a problem that all the old patterns and norms cannot meet, can't address. And he cites a number of these moments in particularly Western history, but also history in the Eastern world as we know it. And he points out that in each of those cases that he cites, it led to what he calls bewilderment. But that triggered then this radical change in thinking and action. And his sort of offer of hope at this point is to say, it feels like, and all the indicators are, that we're at one of those moments in human history again. And what we really now need is that sudden change. And one way to think about that is how we handle our economy, but we'll come back to that later on. So bewilderment may be the thing that stops us. So part of the problem for us, I think, and now we can sort of be talking about how we feel about this, quite apart from the science, quite apart from what we know what it's all gonna do to us. I think oftentimes people just feel like it's intractable. That is, there's nothing we can do about it through individual action. And so you just You do. You sort of mentally throw your hands up in the air and occupy yourself with other things and refuse to talk about it. And it's true, right? There's reason to feel that way because you see the Paris Agreement, which seems to be failing. The national determined commitments that fall short of what's necessary, the failure of international politics, the fact that the Ukraine war, for instance, is a horrible reality, means that we're burning more carbon these days just to make war over what, at the end of the day, is again a sort of a fossil fuel driven conflict. And the fact is, as individuals, we're not people with the power of a John Kerry or an Antonio Guterres of the UN or Jeff Bezos, who might be able to do something about this, right? And then you look at sort of politics and you see the congressional inaction. So there was the American Clean Energy and Security Act in 2009. That was Barack Obama's attempt, failed in the Senate. The Build Back Better Act of 2021, you know where that stands. You see the power and wealth of the fossil fuel lobby, the commitment of both parties, Democrats and Republicans, to this growth economic model that is sustained by fossil fuel interests and fossil fuel burning. The environmental movement itself is fractured these days. It feels like you can't get anything done in some cases because people can't agree on what should be done. And then there's simply the fact that the physical and political landscape are complex and they're joined together at the hip. You can't separate them. So that ends up, in my mind, to be a really good argument for state level action. So why an Oregon state approach? So one possibility, some people would say, we shouldn't bother even with this. So this is a quote from an Oregon politician. I won't tell you who, you don't need to worry. Oregon accounts for only 1% of all GHG emissions globally. A global problem requires a global solution. So why try? He did go on to say we should focus on it. He had positive things, but it was a way of saying, look, we're going to excuse ourselves from doing this because we're really only 1%, right? But just the fallacy of that's clear at the beginning. This is a global problem, right? And global problems require local solutions. So if everybody who was in our boat said our 1% doesn't mean anything, so we're not going to do anything about it, pretty soon you have 100%, right? Big problem. Oregon has neighbors who are willing to work regionally. So Oregon, Washington, California, and California is a powerful actor, just about ready to pass some tailpipe emissions standards, as well as the goal of getting to all electric sold in California by 2035. That would be a huge move. And if Oregon partners with California and Washington and British Columbia in that's a big economy acting in a way that affects the rest of the economy. So you can act locally and regionally and have real impact nationally and globally. International and intergenerational justice absolutely demands that we act. People have a hard time getting their head around this. But if you have children and grandchildren, you start to get your head around this pretty fast. International justice, we're a small percentage of the world's population. We're responsible for about 30% of we're 5% of the population. We're responsible for about 30% of the GHGs in the atmosphere now. So we have a huge responsibility to people who have not been able to enjoy the standard of life we enjoy as a consequence of burning so much fossil fuel over the last 100 plus years. Intergenerational justice, one way to think about that is simply our children and grandchildren, the kind of earth planet we want to leave to them. To think more broadly, when we say intergenerational justice, we talk about the costs that we are imposing. So again, I drive to Safeway and back. I deposit some GHGs in the atmosphere. Those GHGs are going to remain there for 300 to 1,000 years. My impact is not on just my grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, but you get it, right? So this concept of intergenerational justice really demands that we act if we take it seriously at all. The good news again is Oregon has made a really good start. So we had the executive order from Governor Brown in 2020, which has led to, I mean, she basically required all state agencies that have any impact on climate greenhouse gas emissions to craft plans that show that they're going to help us achieve certain goals. So we got the Oregon Climate Action Plan, a real plan. The DEQ, the Oregon Department of Education, Department of Environmental Quality, passed its CPP, Climate Protection Plan, which really forces us to get to zero by 2040 in terms of GHGs through electrical production. We also, the legislature passed a law that accompanies that. We'll talk more about these in detail next week. So Oregon really has made a great start. I should have updated this slide. I will next week. We'll take a look at what Oregon did in the 2022 session. Not everything that we would have hoped to pass came through, but a lot did. And some things really important for justice, climate justice. So next week, that's what we'll be looking at. Before we go to that, I want to do this for you each week. So we're not going to wait until the last session to help you think about how you can act. You can start doing it now. So one of those things is to look to the 2023 legislative session. It's really important to prepare, and there's a bunch of groups that can help you help your legislators prepare and be thinking about what's the right thing to do and to get good legislation passed. And there are opportunities you have every day of the week to take kind of some kind of action. So learn everything you can now. It's surprising who can educate you. Again, I'm not going to take you to the link. I'm going to leave time for conversation. That's actually a link to I just got a link it was from one of my colleagues on the Metro Climate Action Team, the forestry sub-team. And it's this both fascinating but also discouraging story on CBS Morning. I just don't see network TV at all these days. It's like a 5-minute piece on test forests in us what various futures look like in terms of the amount of greenhouse gases we might pump into the atmosphere. It's a very interesting piece, so I recommend it to you. It's about 5 minutes. So learn everything you can, right? Pay attention to the stuff that's available. Right now, call, email, and write letters to your state senator and your representative and urge them. I mean, really, these are the kinds of things we do in the meantime. Even a general notice to your legislator that says, look, there's going to be legislation in the 2023 session that's going to ensure that the governor's executive order and the plans that follow are actually implemented and funded effectively. Every one of those. Just tell your legislator, I'll be watching, and I want you to support those. They read that stuff. They don't get that much between sessions. So if you're contacting them now, that makes a big difference. We'll talk more about this. Legislation that tackles transportation emissions in Oregon, that's a really critical opportunity for good work in the state of Oregon, and stuff, again, that connects up with Washington and California and British Columbia. Whoops, what happened? There we go. Did I just lose it? What do you see now? There we go. Back to it. Sorry. Yeah. Let's see. RUCs. We'll talk about this. Road user charges. Controversial, but probably one of the means by which and those aren't tolls, but rather actual charges to the user of roads. And we can talk more about that. The other thing you can do is get connected with an organization that keeps you in the loop. So again, if you click on this link where it says like this one, it's an opportunity to submit comments on the distribution of funds actually from the not the Build Back Better, the infrastructure bill at the state level for transportation initiatives. And it's really important. Citizen input that says, I don't particularly want you using those funds to increase the freeway around the Moda Center, because all you're doing is giving us more opportunity to burn lots of GHGs. How about these things? And you'll find some resources to do that. Stay involved in politics. I found this out today. I just actually, before I got on my bike to come home from the college, I saw the notice that our Congressman Schrader is in debate with his challenger, Jamie McLeod Skinner, tonight, interestingly. So stay involved, know what those people are saying, and make sure you get to the truth of what they're saying, and vote for the folks that are going to pursue policies that make a difference for us. So organizations you can connect with. Climate Solutions is an Oregon-Washington group, very good. Oftentimes viewed by some people in the environmentalist community as, what's the word I want? They're pretty firm about the need to get to zero faster than not. So sometimes they will not allow things. For instance, I mentioned blue hydrogen, the debate about blue hydrogen and the methane that it emits. They would say no blue hydrogen, none at all. It's not a good transition fuel because it might emit methane. But a very good group. They know what they're doing, really smart people working with them. The Oregon Environmental Council is actually sort of a clearinghouse. They do climate change stuff, but they do all kinds of other things, as their name would suggest. They are a great, you get on their mailing list, they contact you with opportunities to weigh in regularly. Renew Oregon, was actually founded to tackle climate change in particular, and is in coalition with a lot of these other groups and many, many more that I don't list here. They seem to be down on their numbers right now. Staffing, I'm a little surprised. One of the things they do that's really helpful is, and I am going to take you to this link. There you go. So they have right here, Oregon Climate Action Plan. So they've been tracking, and they do a really wonderful job of this. They've been tracking what's happened since the governor's executive order. So if you click on that, you'll see their current, the 2-year progress report. Very, very useful because it gives you, and it's very well written. It gives you a nice survey of what's been done, what needs to happen next, and it's pretty succinct. So it's pretty useful. I like their resources a lot. Back to the PowerPoint. Maybe not. Weird. Hold on a sec here. Huh. Oh, that's the problem. Okay. Sorry, clumsy. All right, there we go. Oregon League of Conservation voters, kind of, to my mind, the best. They're very good at tracking not just climate change, but other environmental issues that we should be aware of. And they're very well targeted at Oregon's needs as an organization. So they're part of the National League of Conservation Voters, but very, very well directed at Oregon issues. Very well run organization. And they're the umbrella under which the Metro Climate Action Team does its thing. And you can click on that link as well. And if you want to get involved, I am on the transportation committee. I'm the only person who is still working. Everybody else is a retiree. It's really a retirees. There are people on this group who they must put in 40 hours a week on this alone. They are hardworking people. I can barely keep up with what they produce, let alone be responsible to participate in meaningful ways. Maybe someday I will get there, but really good. And you feel good. I mean, it's the kind of thing, let me quit sharing and we'll all be together here. It's the kind of thing that really, it's kind of work that makes you feel like you're participating. I said before, resignation is not an option. It's an easy thing to fall into, to just, as I say, throw your hands up in the air and walk away from the problem. But the way to really avoid doing that and to avoid climate despair, and you hear a lot about that these days, is to get involved and do something. It makes all the difference for me in terms of sort of my mental state when it comes to this. All right, I really did talk fast and I skipped some things, so we got time. So I'm happy to take questions, talk, just converse, whatever you want. Fire away.
My granddaughter Lavinia will be 80 years old in the year 2100.
Mm-hmm.
That's not very old.
Yep.
And who knows how long she will live, given technological advances in health. On the other side, given climate change.
Right.
But when I think she'll be 80, she's going to live most of her life with these conditions. So, I mean, that really does bring it home, the intergenerational impact.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, Rob, I had a question for you. This goes back to the beginning of your presentation. You were talking about the 4.19 level of CO2.
Yeah, 419.
400. Oh, it's 419. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And so in regard to that, then, is that like in Oregon? Is that a number for the whole Earth? Are there certain areas, like maybe you go to Eastern Oregon, that it would be lower and it would be higher in the Portland metropolitan area?
No. So the 419 parts per million, the science of this is kind of weird, but it's, sort of measuring the atmospheric blanket. So there are a million parts of, right? And anywhere we measure that, the average is 419 parts per million. The variation is almost nothing. So you think of it as one big blanket. There are, again, the science of this. I'll give you a bibliography next week. There's this great book. I think it's called Just an Introduction to Climate Change, that explains in pretty accessible lay terms the science of this. So the short answer is no. That's pretty much it. That's the nature of the blanket.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Actually, I had a couple other things.
Sure.
First of all, I just wanted to mention, and maybe all of you know about this, but last night I was watching on PBS on Frontline. They had part 1 of a 3-part series, and it's called The Power of Big Oil.
Oh, cool.
And it was pretty upsetting to know that Exxon and other oil companies knew all about this problem, that it was coming in the 70s and early 80s. And then they did this whole big campaign to get people to think, well, we really don't know if the science is real. And so we're way far behind on where we should be, because we can't convince our politicians we need to get on this. But anyway, if you haven't seen it, it's going to be on next Tuesday night at 10 o'clock on PBS and the following Tuesday. Also, I want to just personally let you know, Rob, that I'm very interested in this, but unfortunately next week I'm out of town and I won't be able to get your session. Is there any way I can get material, or through Pastor John or somebody, about what you do next week?
Yeah,
we'll
sure.
record it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'll send you guys can have the power of the slides so you can get the links too. Yeah. Happy to share it. No problem. Yeah. Appreciate it.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah. You jog my memory of something. It'll come back. Anybody else?
Yeah, I have one question. I think you mentioned that Oregon accounts for 1% of all greenhouse gas emissions globally, and the U.S. is 30%.
30%.
So that's about, Oregon is 3% of the U.S. total. What
Yeah,
are the
that's
major
right.
sources of greenhouse gases in Oregon?
Yeah, those are two different figures. So the 1% is ongoing emissions. The 30% is the total of greenhouse gas emissions over the course of history. That is the period of anthropogenic. So they're not comparable numbers. The 30% is referring to how much we've actually produced since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So I don't know. I don't know what the current U.S. I don't know what the percentage that the U.S. produces. We have reduced our contribution in terms of annual contributions. So did you understand my answer first?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm starting to.
Yeah. So when I said 30%, I'm referring to historically the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions that have been emitted since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. We in the United States are responsible for 30% of that total.
Okay.
So the 1% is referring to what we produce annually. So Oregon's responsible 1% of the greenhouse gas emissions globally annually, as opposed to, a historical number. So two different, apples and oranges in terms of numbers.
Yeah, the 1% still seems high. So what are some of the major sources of greenhouse gases?
Here in Oregon, the biggest source is transportation. Energy production, so electricity production, we're declining. So they shuttered Boardman, and they shuttered it early. So I think it was supposed to be 20 this year or last year. It was supposed to be shuttered. They shuttered it sooner than that. Agriculture. Building emissions. So just, sitting with the lights on, using our Zoom, et cetera. That's emissions. So it's a variety of sources. Next week, I'll show you sort of the breakdown for Oregon altogether. So we'll see it. But the big one is transportation. That's where and it's the one that's increasing.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Good question. Yeah.
Do you know of any movements in Oregon working? Because I think my idea of how to approach transportation is having more public transportation available, because it's not feasible for everyone to own an electric car. So are there groups that are already kind of working towards that in Oregon, towards that increasing? I know Portland is always so frustrating because you can get places, it just takes a really long time.
Yep.
And if it didn't take so long, I would take the bus all the time in a heartbeat. But
yeah. So this is, I said, I'm on the Metro Climate Action Team's transportation group. This is a debate we have, and I have to admit, it's sort of my hard-nosed realism. I agree. We should have far better public transportation options. We should probably be constructing our communities so that our access to the things we need, like groceries, et cetera, is close enough that we can walk, bike, et cetera. I think all those things are absolutely true, all great, but they're going to take too long to get to. And talk about a heavy lift in terms of political will, So yes, there are plenty. The answer to your question is there are people who are arguing this pretty vigorously. Whether we can make any headway on it's another question. So I'll sort of show my cards. This is where I'm not just an educator, but I really do have horses in the race. I always think what we really have to do is make electric car ownership accessible to everybody, because that's the way people are going to move. We're not going to escape that. That is an American thing, and it's not going away. So, and it's going to cost something. So it means a kind of progressive approach that is progressive, not progressive politically, but progressive taxes and the uses of revenue and income to ensure that people who can't afford an electric car can afford an electric car. It means learning how to convert gas cars into electric. We know that we can do that. We can do it at a much lower cost than a brand new car. It also has a much lower carbon footprint. because we're not building a brand new car. We're using an existing car. We're converting it to electric. So there's all kinds of things we can do. Again, we just have to sort of educate ourselves as to what those are and how we can get them done and be willing to pay the cost eventually. Yeah, but in answer to your question, I mean, public transportation, if we had the better that's the best solution, but our politics are tough, and I don't know whether we'll ever.
Another thing that I've been thinking about, I don't understand why we're not doing, is when we have new construction, why don't they automatically just put solar panels on it? We have solar panels here at our house, and they are amazing. Plus we have a hybrid. So we have such little energy costs. Plus we also had the good fortune of having geothermal power because we had a lot of land to do it. So our energy costs are just almost nothing.
Yeah.
And if they could make it possible for people just to start out like in new construction,
yeah.
So
here's a nice example of how the politics and the complexity get really, it makes it hard, but we're on our way. So in the 2022, this legislative session we just had, there was a REACH code bill. So I don't know if you're familiar with this. So it would allow, right now the state of Oregon doesn't permit localities, counties, municipalities to have building code regulations that are sort of adventuresome, and because that's really where the rubber hits the road on this. So if you have code language that allows and encourages building homes that are solar ready, building homes that have higher R values in the walls, so better insulation, tighter construction. There's all kinds of things you can do to make sure that buildings are much more efficient. Efficiency is one of the places where we can get a whole bunch of greenhouse gas reductions. The American Energy Efficiency Institute, I think I got the acronym. I don't know if I've got it exactly right. I'm on their mailing list. They're just constantly saying, look, there's all kinds of low-hanging fruit for us to pick. But you got to have the structures in place in terms of how we do the business of building and encouraging building. So it was in the legislature. It didn't get passed. It was replaced by, anybody know this? And I've forgotten it. I mean, it's late in the day and I forget things late in the day. It was replaced with, basically it's sort of a committee approach to thinking. It's probably an okay replacement because there's a sunset on it. They have to really get to their REACH code eventually. But one of the reasons legislators said we don't want to pass the REACH code is because we don't think that it was ambitious enough. Clearly some of them use that as an excuse not to pass it because they didn't want it to pass. But there were others who really did believe that it wasn't ambitious enough. So there's a good example. The 2023 legislative session is going to be a great opportunity to get a bunch of laws passed in the state of Oregon that will make it possible for builders to be much more confident that they're doing the right thing. Another place where codes will make a difference. We should be eliminating natural gas. As much as I hate to say it, natural gas we know now is a terrific cause of methane emissions, sort of ghosts, methane emissions that we didn't realize were there. And we can get along without natural gas in Oregon. We just need to ramp up our solar and wind and hydro.
The natural gas industry sold that on putting the word natural in front of gas. It's natural. Must be okay.
And they still say we're the bridge fuel between the petrochemical and the renewable, but we can't afford bridge fuel anymore. We're up against it. Yeah.
Electric cars. I understand, it's cleaner. You're not burning gas, fossil fuel, but yet around here, when you're charging your car, you're using water. And you talked about, the lesser snowpack and the less amount of water in the snowpack and early runoff.
Yep.
So I don't know how to ask it, is that kind of the lesser of two evils, or when it comes to electricity versus gasoline?
Yeah, it's, there's a number of ways in which electric cars still don't really meet the standard. So if there's a annual rating of, the greenest car to buy. And this last year, the greenest car to buy was not an electric car. It's still a hybrid. And because when you think of the life cycle cost of an object like that, so you take into account the carbon you burn to create it, the carbon you burn to get the resources necessary to create it in the first place. So you do that whole life cycle analysis. And electric cars, they're like the second and third best are electric cars, but they still haven't gotten the number one spot. And one of the aspects of life cycle analysis is how you create the electricity that powers your car. That's why at the same time that you're electrifying transportation, you have to make renewable your production of electricity.
Wind and solar type.
Exactly. Right. So, and again, because of Oregon, we got rid of Boardman.
Right.
Feel a little bit better, but yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. Nancy.
Oh, well, I've been doing a lot of talking here, but yeah, see, we've got the solar panels, and then right now on our hybrid, we're getting about 150 miles per gallon because we run around town a lot. Mm-hmm. And then we just come and we plug it in, here. And so it's amazing. There's a freedom in it, and I'm not too worried about, well, I shouldn't do this, or, oh, this happened, I have to make an extra trip. I don't feel guilty because it's all on my electric power that's coming off of my, barn roof.
Yeah. So, we're having the debate in this household right now. As a matter of fact, this evening over dinner, Mitzi and I were talking about it again. We have a 2007 Toyota Corolla that it still gets like 38 miles per gallon. It's a great car. And we're not interested. I am disinclined to buy a fully electric car yet, because I think the advances are quick. So I keep arguing that we should go over to, anybody know Platt Auto on McLaughlin? They sell used electric cars, and they sell lots of used Leafs. And I really want to buy, like one of those 6-7-year-old Leafs for about, I think we could scrape that loan together for $9,000 or whatever. That'd be the car we drive around town. When Mitzi has to go to her art shows or whatever, she can drive the gas car, but it just makes me feel so much better. But I keep losing that argument. So, anyway.
Do we call it a night?
Yeah, we can. It's fine.
Yeah. Thank you, Rob.
Yep, sure. So happy to chat again next week if you're interested to be here. So we'll keep plugging away at it, and regardless, get involved.
Yes.
So
thank you. Okay. And invite a friend next week.
Have a good night, guys.
All right.